Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Building Educator Capacity, a podcast by CESA 2, where we strive to improve student learning by expanding the capacity of our school districts. I'm Mitchell Lilly, and I'm joined by Phil Anderson.
It's always great to be here.
On today's episode, we'll be diving into the capacity building framework developed by CESA 2 consultants, why it's important, and how CESA 2 is implementing it into its training frameworks, benefiting both districts and staff.
Today's conversation will take place between two of our consultants. One is Ed O'Connor, who has a PhD and directs the Data and Strategic Planning Center of Excellence for CESA 2. Previously, Ed has had 15 years experience as a school psychologist and as a director of continuous improvement and assessment, working at all areas from 4K to 12. Ed has longstanding research interests in the areas such as early literacy, instruction and assessment, effective instruction, preparing students to be college and career ready, and much more. Also in this conversation is Elizabeth Freeman, who has been supporting CESA 2 schools since 2015. Her areas of specialty include school systems, school improvement, data analysis, strategic planning, RTL, MTSS, and pupil service delivery. Elizabeth practiced as a school psychologist near Madison, Wisconsin, after receiving her doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2007.
So Ed and I are so excited to spend some time today talking about the CESA 2 capacity building framework. And for us, we feel like this framework really helps to accelerate our districts, both as individuals and as systems, in terms of putting together effective and impactful professional development and change plans. So really attending to these different components makes the efforts they spend to grow their staff so much more effective and efficient and impactful. So we're really excited to be spending some time talking about this framework today. So the pieces that we want to highlight here are kind of the why. Why did we develop this framework, and what need were we trying to address? And part of the original kind of observation that we made, along with Gail Anderson, who is now working at the Wisconsin state level at our Department of Public Instruction, but at this time was with CESA 2, is we didn't really as an organization have a great way to organize the supports we were offering to districts. And additionally, we weren't really paying attention to what we knew from the research literature about individuals' growth and development in terms of learning and instructional practices. We weren't taking into account that research and really being clear about what offerings were good fits for people and how to kind of go along that progression. So for example, the research literature indicates, and we know very well now, maybe we didn't 30 years ago, but now it's quite clear that the most effective professional development is not simply going and attending a one-day workshop and then, you being able to go and do whatever the workshop was about. And so we really started this discussion around being clear and thoughtful about what is best practice in professional development, and then making sure to develop a framework that we then could use to organize our supports for districts and that they could use to help best select our offerings to be a good fit for them.
Can I chime in a little bit? Yeah. So I think, just a little more in terms of context here. The CESA 2 mission statement reflects the idea that we are focused on building the capacity of our diverse districts, the diverse districts that we serve. And one of the early discussions as we were trying to adhere to that mission, or even to figure out what does that mean, we quickly got to the question about what does building and expanding capacity mean. And so the capacity building framework was also part of an early attempt to be coherent in our development as our organization was reflecting on itself and trying to improve our offerings, as Elizabeth said. So the capacity building framework created a better description of what it means to build capacity from our perspective. And I think, as Elizabeth said, the research and as we got into the literature, the capacity building framework defined the range of experiences that are necessary, but each in and of themselves not sufficient to produce change in schools. And so while lots of people have attended individual workshops and gained a lot of information, that in and of itself isn't sufficient to create change. And so our objective was to figure out how to help structure our professional development support so that we maximize the impact, as Elizabeth said, and connect it back to our mission in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one other piece that I want to emphasize and definitely touches on what Ed just said is the idea that this framework that we ended up developing applies to individuals that make up that system. And we'll talk about the anchors of our framework in just a minute, but it applies to individuals and their progression towards building capacity, but it also can be applied to systems themselves. So systems like a school system, a district, are complex and multifaceted. So we need individuals within that system to progress along this capacity building cycle. But implementation science and continuous school improvement tells us that we also have to attend to certain system features. And the good thing is we can take that into account within this framework as well. Ed, are there any other kind of rationale or need components that are important for people to know before we move on to talking a little bit about the continuum or the framework itself?
I think, again, just to reinforce the idea that the framework represents a full continuum that is necessary to address in pursuit of real, meaningful, and sustainable change. And so it's not to suggest that any individual stage you'll hear people talk about one and done is not a good way to go about school change. And that's very true. But in and of itself, that may not be, that still can be part of the professional development continuum. So you do need to be, as we start to talk about the steps in the framework, you need to become aware of the ideas and the information. We need to continue to scan and monitor the research with regard to effective schools, effective professional development, effective systems. But we need to do more than that too. We need to develop a deep enough understanding of what it is that we're thinking about trying or what we believe is a best practice. And then we see, and the research supports the idea that it's really important to experience some direct and explicit instruction and coaching and feedback as you try new practices and try to deploy best practices. And then we need to think about sustainability and then sort of developing some local expertise, which will be necessary to continue to sustain a practice within a district.
Ed, I really loved what you just laid out there. I think that's really, really helpful and insightful. I think one thing that resonated with me is this idea that some of the things we're describing or some of the ways we've done business in the past, you referenced like the one and done or workshops, that those maybe are best thought of as necessary but not sufficient. In order to create true change in schools that impact students positively, we really have to have a coordinated and sustained effort that goes beyond people attending random professional development, getting random expertise, attending something and then not having, it be sustained in practice. I think it's important to note a piece of this that maybe we're going to lean into more heavily than we have in the past is the idea of really supporting that practice. So what will become clear in our discussion, and hopefully as you reflect on your experiences in education or even other related fields, sometimes we get a lot of information that helps us to understand a practice or understand content, but not a lot of information and support in actually doing that new practice or doing that new thing. So one thing to listen to when we talk about this model is the leaning into the piece that we have to support individuals in the doing of something new. And that typically happens through modeling and coaching, embedded coaching, and really, making sure that individuals get the support they need to do something different, right? So sometimes I use with this some examples from health situations people have been in. But many of us know if we're trying to make a health or behavior change that doing something is good for us. Exercising every week is good for us, for example. But just knowing it doesn't create the actual change in our behavior. And the research has indicated we need support in making those changes or doing something different or doing something new. And so to summarize, I think the idea that what we've done in the past is necessary, is a part of this, but it may not be sufficient. And so together, we need to take into account that whole continuum, that whole framework, if we really want things to look different or be different in our school. Just to give an advanced organizer, and again, this will be in some of the materials that are linked here in this podcast, but there's kind of these 5 stages that we talk about for our framework, and they are awareness, understand, practice, refine, and teach. And so, yeah, Ed, do you want to talk a little bit about some characteristics of the awareness stage?
Sure. So again, reflecting on what each stage looks like, the aware level is the circumstance where you are learning or first becoming aware or introduced to a topic or an idea, or we talk often about innovations, things in education that are new or newer extensions. And those, the aware level of readiness or capacity usually comes through seeing a presentation, connecting with other professionals, online research, a workshop, those opportunities to hear about what's new and exciting and what potentially is important for us to dig a little bit deeper into, to consider including these tools or practices in our improvement effort. And so, aware is that really fundamental first part. The second step in terms of understand, or that we label understand, is the place where we've decided, yeah, that's something that seems to be of value and has some credibility, at least on the surface. Let's explore more deeply and understand how what this topic is really involved. Establish some initial connections to the work or the practice, and really understand the rationale and more deeply understand the research and support, particularly for why a practice or a change in, our innovation, or a new innovation or a change in our practice would be appropriate to pursue. Once we've understood and we have a basic set of knowledge, and sometimes for an individual, you can think about being ready to try this out with some support. And we really believe that, again, what the research has shown is that trying it out independently without support and feedback is often a very low level of, has a low level of success. And of course, when we're doing something new, we're not going to deliver it with fidelity. We're not going to be experts at our first attempt. And so the practice level is the level at which we're talking about trying it out, working to do it right, and getting support and feedback and guidance about how to shape our behavior or our use of a practice in a way that improves our capacity to do it as intended. At the practice level, our desire is to maintain fidelity, is a word that you'll hear talked about a lot, but not just for the sake of filling out a checklist or saying that we did all the parts, but really for the sake of demonstrating that we can do the practice as it's defined, and then we can consider what the impacts are. In the refined stage, then there's an opportunity to reflect on what does our experience in becoming good at or trying these practices in our context, what have we learned, both in terms of our individual needs with regard to being successful in delivering the practice, and with respect to how the practice fits within the system. And there are opportunities at the refined stage to reflect on data about impact, data about application success, and to make adjustments at that stage that will allow for the impact to potentially be improved within a particular setting or for a particular individual by making some fine adjustments that don't violate the general principles and practices that are described in the innovation, if you will, and then to develop further expertise within your setting to get ready to possibly coach and provide feedback to others as you try and scale and sustain some practice. And then the last stage is the teach stage. And not everybody, or not every system, in order to sustain effective practices going forward, needs to reach the teach stage with some individuals. You have to develop some internal expertise to coach and support and sustain the practice. And at this point, those who become the teachers and the local experts have developed their expertise, they have experience, sufficient knowledge and skill to guide others from the starting point, to give good feedback and support so that others can learn the practice and implement it with fidelity and also benefit from that level of support. So that's really what the capacity building framework is. Those five steps, if you will.
Yeah, so I think from Ed, from your description, what's I think really helpful is being aware that these 5 steps are on this, or stages are on this continuum, and they really build upon what happens in the prior stage, so to speak. I think it's quite clear, and I think if we all take a pause and maybe think about some effort or innovation we've been involved in our various districts, workplaces, that the pros and cons of kind of having this kind of a framework as a pro, and maybe the con of the way we've done it in the past. So the idea, I can think of many examples for myself where maybe I've attended a workshop or a conference and I've come away, and then 6 months later I realized, gosh, I have not applied the things that I wanted to and I set out to apply that I had learned in that setting. And so this, I think, helps to give us a framework that we can apply to our own individual learning and to our systems learning. And I think it gives us a more realistic vision for how efforts will take shape and take hold and actually come to fruition. And I think it also allows us to say that if we're all grabbing at individual things, it's not going to have an impact, right? So we all can do our own thing. We all can grab training, but to some extent that becomes inefficient because nothing actually changes in practice, unless we're just trying to garner awareness. So a workshop, a conference will allow us to grab some awareness and some understanding, but it maybe is not realistic to think that we will come back and have changes in our practice as a result of that one thing. So it helps us to be more realistic and potentially more selective as to how much stuff we can appropriately support and scale up as we go forward.
I was just going to chime in. I think that an example of how this looks from the system level, where we approach this with an emphasis on system thinking first and foremost, but it certainly, as we've described, can apply to individuals within a particular practice and where they are in their learning and capacity building. But thinking from a systems perspective, you said a few things, Elizabeth, that are really important. Historically, we've often had people and we've delivered a really wide swath or a wide variety of professional development on a lot of topics. And so people become aware of lots of things that they potentially should be doing, but very rarely, as we talk to teachers and administrators and anybody in the system, do they receive a lot of support for figuring out how to change their day-to-day practice that to include something new and different, which requires not only knowing what to do, but also what not to do. And a lot of the support that comes from coaching as you're trying out and trying to get better in the practice and refine stages, a lot of that um, experience is about what does this replace? How do I manage the time and resource to be able to do something new? As opposed to what we hear from districts and teachers in particular, but all educators and administrators lament the fact that there are so many things coming at us that we should be doing and so many good ideas that we get buried in initiatives. And people talk about initiative overload. And so I think this capacity framework, one systems level application would be for a district leadership team or a building leadership team to think about any practice that they're trying to scale or any change that they're trying to accomplish and reflect on, have we done a sufficient job of making people aware and having the necessary understanding of what this is and why we're doing it? And then maybe even more importantly, or equally important, but to continue that through, have we supported folks in developing and trying the practice of getting feedback through coaching, through PLC reflections, and those kinds of structures? Have we a plan for supporting refinement to improve things in context? And are we collecting data that will help us to do that? And do we have a long-term vision for how we're going to continue to teach others how to do this? And are we building internal expertise, or are we always going to just have external folks come in and teach this to us? So I think that's an example of how this is really a critical mental organizer potentially for those who are responsible for organizing professional development plans and fulfilling strategic objectives and allocating resources to these professional development pieces.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and hopefully it makes a little more clear this idea of the application at the individual and the system level, and having that example. I think for most of us, we can envision what it looks like for an individual as ourselves as an individual learner, but I think to have a sense for when we talk about that system application, having that example is really, really helpful. So I think the idea being here that we kind of, what are we doing with this? Or, it's great to have a framework, but how are we applying it in our work? And I would say CESA 2 as an organization is trying to help you as an individual learner or as a system to understand and for us to be more transparent about our different supports and how they might fit into the need or the level you are at, so to speak, in terms of your professional development or growth. And so our offerings, you'll notice like on our catalogs and our communications, we're trying to be clear about what level, so to speak, we're gearing things towards. So is this just where we're trying to gain awareness of a new practice, a new system, and you can come and become a little more aware or understand that? Or is this really something that we're trying to help support you in the doing of the work? And so we're trying to be more communicative around our offerings certainly Ed and I in our work with individuals and districts very much so use this language, use this framework. And the example Ed just gave is very true to a lot of our work with districts, with trying to sit around and, together and say, gosh, okay, so you've done some training for your staff, but gosh, have they had any coaching support? Okay, then that's our next step. So really looking at applying that framework in vivo is a lot of what we spend our time doing. So I think next steps for you as an individual, if you're interested in this, certainly check out the resources that we've provided in the podcast notes. And I would also say, we've talked a lot about some things that maybe require a system, right? So if we're saying, gosh, as an individual learner, you might need coaching support, I think I want to be clear, that's not to say that you can't apply this framework to your own learning without a system supporting you behind you. So I think just think about your own learning. And if you go to a workshop, that's great. But what do you need in addition to that workshop? What support that you have control over? Can you try to make sure that you get to that level of actually implementing in your classroom that innovation or that practice, and get creative? You can pull in a peer, you can pull in a lot of schools have coaches now, but the idea that don't set yourself up to fail because, with applying this framework, that it's not realistic to expect you to be able to do a practice to a high level of fidelity after just going to one training on one day for 1 hour. So I think apply this as an individual to your own learning. Certainly, if you're, able to encourage your system to apply this type of thinking, both for individual learners within your system and as a system as a whole, we think based on the research that we've read and kind of how studies are going, that this is really the most effective way to create change in schools and to have a positive impact on student outcomes.
Excellent, Elizabeth.
With CESA 2's capacity building framework, we wanted to account for individual growth and the process to progress. It's not just growing from one workshop, but showing how a workshop works in the overall process of professional development.
Yeah, as Ed and Elizabeth were talking about, I think it's unrealistic to expect large changes in your practice from just one workshop. However, by becoming aware and understanding different topics and having those as the building blocks makes it easier to practice and refine our skills in order to fulfill strategic goals. And this can work for just the individual or the entire system. So we have this framework to really help improve everyone in our school districts.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to another episode of CESA 2's Building Educator Capacity. We hope to see you next time. Special thanks to Liz Elliott, band teacher at Whitewater Middle School in Whitewater, Wisconsin, for the music used in this podcast.